Okay, welcome back to another Geopolitical Futures podcast. Cole is in the salt mines doing something else this week, so he won't be hosting. And we have a special treat that I don't think is going to be a special treat because George is going to be joining us at least once a month on the podcast from now on. So say hello, George.
Hello. I never miss a chance to talk and be heard and not listen. So here I am. Let's enjoy ourselves.
So for this podcast, what we did was we actually asked you folks on social media what questions you wanted George to answer. And a surprising number of you asked about George's feelings and thoughts about the coming war with Japan, which was his first book. We're going to leave that alone for now. We're going to come back and do another episode on that. But just so you all know, we heard your questions. We're listening. We'll get back to that in a completely separate episode. But I want to start off with a couple of different questions. The first one comes from Ruthie. And Ruthie wants to know, George, what the impact on the global economy is going to be of China's impending slowdown. So less on China, but what do you think the world is going to feel as a result of it?
Well, China's slowdown isn't impending. It's happened. It's been going on since 2008. One of the major impacts, perhaps the single most important impact on the global system, is impact on the price of minerals, particularly oil, natural gas less. Since China became the major industrial force, the oil industry kind of organized itself around Chinese consumption. Well, Chinese consumption, we saw in the papers today, is going down, has to. And really, that decline of consumption or growth rates, as they expected before, had something to do with the 2014 decline. So it has a tremendous effect because now countries that are major exporters of oil, Russia and Saudi Arabia in particular, have huge economic problems due to that. So what's happening in the world right now is that as China tries to rebalance away from being dependent on exports, hard to do, other countries have to rebalance on not expecting China to be consuming raw materials. Those countries that are not major exporters, like the United States, are in a particularly strong position. So what China's decline does is really destabilize oil exporters to a great extent. It also provides huge opportunities for other developing countries, Vietnam, Colombia, places like this, to compete with China and defeat China in China's core area. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that China has now decided it wants to compete in artificial intelligence and all things technical. And they can do that. They're up against Japan, the United States, South Korea, Germany. But, welcome to the club, China, if you want to do that. So the point is that not only do we have this problem with exporters and oil producers, you have this interesting dilemma developing on high tech as China tries to not only compete with major technical countries, but outcompete them.
So we're recording on Thursday today. One of the things in the news today is that China landed a lunar rover on the far side of the moon. You alluded to artificial intelligence. How do you think about China's assertions that all of these technological advantages are going to change the system for them?
Well, landing something on the moon is from the 1960s. This is technology that's over half a century old. It's good that China has reached this point, but it's only reached this point. The kind of technologies that we're going to be competing with over the next 10, 20 years, we don't know yet. We don't know what the technologies are going to be. Nobody anticipated in 1970 that the microchip developed for the F-14 fighter was going to revolutionize the way you shop. I'm going to lie in bed at night going through Amazon and buying books. Nobody anticipated that. The thing that's going to really be critical is what that next technology is. And of course, everybody's saying it's going to be artificial intelligence because you go back to the 1960s when the automobile became mature, everybody was talking about the Jetsons and jetpacks and supersonic transports, and it was all about transportation, because that was the critical technology then. So now, whenever we talk about the next technology, we extrapolate. It's going to be artificial intelligence. Not sure what that is, but it's going to be very good. The thing that's going to come out is something we don't anticipate. And that's where China has an opportunity. But that's also where Paraguay has an opportunity. Those nations that grasp the new emerging technologies have a chance to compete in a world market like no one else. But the funny thing is, some countries have advantages, but in identifying that thing which we didn't anticipate, that's a tough one.
Yeah. Do you know what they're calling, what the Chinese are calling their rockets that they're using to send things to the moon?
Melvin?
No, the Long March rockets.
Yes, well, they've been using the Long March for a long time. They are resurrecting Mao an awful lot. And that's one of the interesting things. I mean, Mao stabilized China. He stabilized China by cutting off international trade. Coastal China and interior China are playing in the same deck. Poor, but stable. Deng Xiaoping opened it up, and China destabilized. Not for a long time, but now is in that process. Now, this could be just symbolic that he wants to kind of draw on Mao, or it could be that he has somewhere in his mind that the Maoist solution to the chaos prior to 1948, cutting off from the world, is on his mind. It's hard to say what's on his mind, obviously. It's hard to say what he can do, but there it is. It's the Long March.
All right, well, this kind of segues well into this. Bill wants to know not about the coming war with Japan, but he wants to ask you about the next 100 years. And he wants to ask you if anything has happened since you wrote the next 100 years with China or Russia that makes you more sure of your forecasts on China or Russia, or less certain of your forecasts.
Confined solely to China and Russia, more secure. Russia has economically been unable to develop, is a third world country exporting a commodity whose price it can't control, oil. And the price of that commodity has gone down to the 40s again. So its ability to maintain its society under those circumstances remains pretty much what I expected. In China, I expected China to reach a limit to the rapid growth that had occurred. My model for that was Japan, because Japan did the same thing. And the world oohed and awed how Japan was going to take over the world, and so they did about China. But there's a limit to how much you can grow. And the essential problem that the Chinese had was they couldn't consume the stuff they produced. That depended on other countries, particularly Europe and mostly the United States. And in depending on the United States to consume, it assumed that the United States was going to be prepared, one, financially, to do that consumption, and two, absorb the cost of doing so. So in both countries, we've seen what I thought would happen. In China, we have a dictatorship. In Russia, we have Russia trying to show itself to be a great power to its people, so they don't notice that the stores are getting bare again. Was I right in the rest of things? I got lots of things I want to talk about that I'm wrong on, but these two things I'm pretty confident in.
Well, what's the one thing that you would single out that you wish you could have back if you could do it over?
I assumed that the Middle East would become stable, because without Russians and the Americans competing, there was going to be no external power to destabilize it. So we kind of turned into backwater. The thing that I miscalculated, and this was really before I wrote Next 100 Years, the thing I really miscalculated was the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. I miscalculated Al-Qaeda, miscalculated the Islamic State. I miscalculated the degree to which the end of the Cold War would open the door for these groups. And that was not so much in the next 100 years, it was before that. But it was my fundamental error about how the world would evolve.
Well, this actually plays on that, and a number of people asked this question, but Raymond was the one I think who asked it first. But people want to know, what is Donald Trump's effect on U.S. foreign policy, and specifically, what does it look like now that the U.S. is talking about pulling out of Syria and Afghanistan, if anything?
Well before Donald Trump, I said the United States could not maintain its presence in the Middle East. We had waged a war for 17, 18 years. We lost the war. Our solution was to put insufficient force in these countries, enough to take casualties, not enough to achieve anything. Nobody wanted to face the fact that we lost. But deeper than that, the United States was the only global power. Global powers like Britain did not use their own force constantly to wage war. It created coalitions of those who were opposed to some faction in their country that needed some help. And that's how Britain conquered India. It had very little force there. Now, the United States became the only global power in 1992 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And we really had no model for how to operate in the world. Our model was still the Cold War model. I'm a hammer, and I'm looking for a nail to hit. And the problem was that we could not spread ourselves so thin. So therefore, my expectation was the United States, under any president, was going to have to reduce its presence, its exposure. It did not have enough force to constantly wage full-scale war. Anything less was hopeless. Even full-scale war was hopeless, and therefore pull out. So Donald Trump is an interesting figure because he is bizarre in many ways. Yet his foreign policy has been consistent around a number of points. For example, in Korea, he confronted and negotiated with Kim. Well, this has been going on since the Clinton administration. Withdrawal from Afghanistan, that had been discussed in the late Bush administration. Involvement in Poland and Romania, again, through the Obama administration. Most of the things that he has done have been evolutionary based on the principle that I laid out, over the course of the last dozen years. When you look at what he did, it's actually both modest and reasonable. When you look at what he says and how he does it, it gets exciting. So his decision to withdraw from Turkey, for example, made sense. His decision to get out of Syria, I should say. That decision took 2,000 troops and pulled them out. Well, those 2,000 troops weren't doing that much, but they could take an awful lot of casualties. That's a lot of troops. They're scattered in a lot of places, and they're in danger as they're moving to extraction. Well, we heard recently that it was going to be 5 months until there's a pullout. So one, the withdrawal from Syria was not only not something that was that unreasonable, it was something that many of his critics demanded years before. Get out of the Middle East. The second thing was the way he did it and announced it was extremely strange and destabilizing. The third thing is that the way he finally did it was perfectly rational. So you are in a situation here where the sequence that he has, he does something that is defensible but announces in such a way that it's incomprehensible and finally does it not too badly. It's hard to understand whether this is the brilliance of a Metternich or Donald Duck. I can't figure out which it is, but it gets to the point. I think he is a far more complex man than his critics want him to be. But then anyone is more complex than his critics want him to be.
Well, does the how matter? Or is the how really just window dressing and you have to focus on larger issues?
Well, when you're a sergeant in the Special Forces operating in Syria with Kurdish, Turkish, Russian troops around you, the how really matters. Very often in anything you do, the how matters. You build a house. You don't build a foundation. The how matters. So it does matter. But I think the interesting thing about Trump and his critics is that many of his critics wanted the kind of things that he did. So, for example, he refused to go to war over Korea. Many of his critics were terrified that he would go to war over Korea. He didn't. Then he was criticized for giving in to Kim. So it's a wonderful thing to watch. Trump and his critics, they need each other because it occupies their time. They criticize each other, and none of them step back and try to say, okay, what exactly is going on here? Trump certainly doesn't. His critics don't. And from my point of view, late at night, I can read a newspaper and get a chuckle.
David, shout out to David, who went to two, I think at least to one of our conferences that we held a couple of years ago, wants to know Well, first of all, do you still think of the United States as the predominant global power, or do you start to think that the world is a little more multipolar? And do you think that this is still the American century that we're living in, or have the competitors begun to close the gap?
Well, thanks for coming to conferences. Yeah, the United States, when you get rid of the rhetoric, is 1/4 of the world's economy. The next one, China, is foundering and is the only power that is able to project a military force globally. So whether you're looking at the South China Sea, the Sea of Japan, whether you're looking at the Middle East, whether you're looking in Europe, the U.S. is there. No other country does that. The United States goes through these periods of self-deprecation. I remember the Vietnam War. We had lost our credibility. We had lost our moral standing. The United States had lost the ability to influence world events. No, we just screwed up in Vietnam. The point is that the United States is so powerful, it can afford to make mistakes. And that's one of the dangers to other countries. A risk that is unbearable for them is a throwaway line for us. So, to the contrary, I mean, certainly the United States is admired in the sense that when we take worldwide polls and you ask people where they'd rather live, it's always the United States as the overwhelming choice. It is disliked intensely as a global power, as being duplicitous, brutal, and so on. In other words, it's regarded as Britain was in the 19th century. Leading powers are never liked. What's interesting about the United States is that in the United States, there are large factions that believe the United States is in decline. There are large factions that believe that primarily because of the chaos of our political system. Well, our founders created a political system that wasn't that important. Private life was important. So as I say, I just came back from Europe, and when I say, look, if in Budapest or Paris you had what's going on in Washington, your country would be paralyzed. In the United States, you have what's going on in Washington, and life goes on. That's what our founders created. They created a government that doesn't work because they feared its power, and they've succeeded magnificently. We have a government that not only doesn't work, it's shut down, yet life goes on. And that means that we are not a European power. We should not be thought of as a European power. We're a unique entity that was created to be what we are. And that means that we can withstand internal shocks that European countries couldn't.
All right, last question, and it's a two-parter. Half of it comes from Andrew and half of it comes from Kayla. And their questions are, Andrew wants to know where you think Australia fits into this whole puzzle, and Kayla wants to know where Canada fits in. So put those two together.
Well, Australia fits in kind of south of the equator, somewhere south of Asia.
Okay, and that's it. We're out.
No, that's for my wife, who's Australian. Canada is north of the United States. Where do they fit in? They are significant industrial powers. Both are significant exporters of primary commodities. Neither have the ability to protect their own national interests. Australia is a country that survives on international trade. That trade is maritime trade, and it does not control the sea lanes. Therefore, Australia has to be aligned with whatever country does control the sea lanes so that it can have that protection. And it has to pay a price for that, usually political alignment, sometimes military alignment. And that's where Australia fits in. It is an enormously important area of the world. It provides resources to Asia. It engages in intense international trade with the United States, but it is not able to provide for its national security under all circumstances. That happens only rarely, that it's dangerous, but when it happens, it is really dangerous. And so that's Australia. Canada has the misfortune, as Mexico, to border the United States. Its population is generally about 100 miles from the U.S. border, and a great deal of its trade is north-south rather than east-west. It's a highly heterogeneous country. Quebec speaks French. In Calgary, I can't understand them. It's a diverse country. Economically, it's deeply integrated into the United States, and culturally as well. They're very different countries. They are both heirs of the British Empire. They're both places where the English settled and created cultures that others are now fitting into. They operate differently, but they have in common the fact that they're large countries with small populations, and in the end, they fall into the orbit of other countries. They don't like it. They would rather not be in that position, but that's their reality. If Australia is going to be an international trading company, it needs a maritime partner with the Navy. If Canada wants to engage in intense trade, it's going to do that with the United States. And that means that the kind of tension that sometimes occurs always occurs. And one of the things that you need to learn in geopolitics is that political is not necessarily the most significant. It is merely one dimension of power. And in both cases of these countries, it's not defining in its relationship to the world.
All right, well, before we get out of here, George actually just wrote a column this past week, the title of which was What Happened to Us? And it was kind of a wrap-up of 2018. It also, think of it as a companion piece to our 2019 annual forecast, which you can all check out at www.geopoliticalfutures.com. But George, can you explain, maybe in just a couple sentences, what happened in 2018 and what the outlook you see is for 2019?
Yes, I want to remind everybody to please buy a subscription. I need the money. We have to pay the rent. We're about to be evicted. Take care of us. Anyway, the question was?
The question was, can you, in a few sentences, sort of sum up 2018 and then what you're looking forward to, or what you think are the most important issues in 2019 that you'd like to highlight out of the forecast?
Well, I can explain it or do it in a few sentences. Tell me which one.
Explain it and I'll cut the rest.
Okay. So, what's happening here is still the reverberations of 2008. 2008 demonstrated the dangers of interdependence, which is that if some guy at Morgan Stanley comes up with the idea of subprime mortgages, the entire banking system of the world can collapse. The point here is that we came out of World War II assuming that the coalition that won the war would continue at the Security Council. After every war, that's the illusion that it's going to happen. Well, it hasn't happened. It didn't happen. But a lot of people drew the conclusion from this that I was pessimistic about the world. I'm not pessimistic about the world. Turmoil, unrest, and war is the natural condition of human beings, and there are intermediate periods where these go away. They're nice. But the idea that came out with this idea of the end of history is that somehow the fundamental structure of human existence was about to change. That war, misery, and everything would be abolished. The economies would grow eternally. Each nation would go to international courts to settle issues. The rule-based system that they fantasized. Well, it was a fantasy of the Cold War, of the victory. It is a fantasy that is showing itself with its full fury as we proceed. But what do we expect? We came out of a century that had the First World War and the Second World War and the Cold War with the near nuclear war. The idea that this century is going to be the Garden of Eden was the fantasy. But remember also the magnificent things that were done in the 20th century. The technical things that were done, the music that was written, the books that were written. We have managed as human beings to combine the most horrible crimes with the transcendental beauties that have been created. The 21st century will be like that. All I'm trying to do is to point out that there's a reason that things seem to be coming apart, and also to point out that they're just going back to normal. And if we understand that, then we can have certainly not calm, but any sense of proportion. And that is what is profoundly lacking these days, any sense of proportion. Everything is either the worst or the best. Usually they're neither. They're okay.
All right, well, on that note, I think we will say goodbye. And until next time, that was George. I'm Jacob. See y'all out there.